It's time for Townscape. Townscape, where Tempo FM tracks down and investigates things of interest in the local community. Hello and welcome to Townscape, Wetherby 200. I'm Eric Ovenden. In October of 1824, the Great Sale of Wetherby took place over 4 days. There was a lot to find out about that event and also about the history of Wetherby when Roger Taylor and Ian Ledley came into studio to talk to my good friend Paul Andrews and myself. It's great to welcome you guys into studio because we're going to be talking about Wetherby 200. So, Roger, Wetherby 200, what's it all about?
Well, that's a good question.
I'm hoping for a good answer.
Put it this way, in October it will be 200 years since the Duke of Devonshire sold Wetherby. He owned about 98% of it, and he was he must have been short of money because we don't know whether he wanted the money to pay gambling debts or whether he wanted to spend it on Chatsworth. But basically he decided to sell the manor and lands and everything. Upwards of 1,300 acres comprising all the desirable farms and lands, generating about £5,000 per annum, which in 1824 was a hell of a lot of money. And they brought in some London auctioneers, which upset quite a few local people because there were auctioneers around here. And basically, in equivalent terms to today's money, he got something like £1.5 million for it. It took 4 days. There was a lot of individual lots comprising houses, pubs, inns, buildings and farms and small pieces of land here and there. One of my favourite stories, during the auction, there was a garden that somebody had created from a piece of wasteland. And when the auctioneer called for the first offer, the first bid, the man who had made this garden stood up and said, "I've made this garden, I don't want to lose it, I don't think that would be fair, etc., etc." And the auctioneer said, "Any bids?" And the man who had made the garden said, "Yes, me," and he made his bid, and the auctioneer knocked it down to him, so nobody else could come and get it. It turned Wetherby on its head from a town of tenants to a town of owners. It's had an impact on Wetherby then, and it still had an impact because a lot of the individual lots can still be identified. We know, for example, the Swan and Talbot was there, various other pubs and inns were there, and we have an original copy of the catalogue. We have other material, and we thought, Ian, myself, some other members of the Old Men's Parliament and Wetherby Civic Society thought, well, we can't just let it go. We can't just let the date drift by. So we thought we'd do something about it. And the result was Wetherby 200. We've been supported, and we're very grateful for this, by Leeds City Council, by Leeds City Council Local Community Committee, by the Leeds City of Culture group, by local charities, local business. Wetherby Town Council have been very kind. Their clerk and the communications officer have been extremely helpful to us. Obviously, it costs quite a bit. So a lot of these things, as I've said before to people, these things don't just happen, and there's a lot of effort's gone into it.
Can I take us back? You're saying that in 1824, the Duke of Devonshire was flogging off Wetherby. How long had the town been in the care and the charge of the Duke of Devonshire's?
That's a good question. Do you know the answer to that, Ian?
Well, I can hazard a guess, but it goes back to inheritances within the aristocracy. And I think it goes back as far as the dissolution of the monasteries, when all the land in England was basically divvied up amongst the lords and ladies. And I think Bess of Hardwick, who's a famous figure.
Yes.
I think she's involved in the mix, and somehow it came down through the family into the Duke of Devonshire's possession.
So it had been, we think, in their family for some 200 or 300 years at least by that time. So presumably it must have been quite a big decision that occasioned selling off Wetherby, because being on the road to the north, presumably Wetherby would have been quite a prosperous sort of place, and you wouldn't want to give that up very readily?
I think it depends on your need for cash. I think many landlords at the time were not landlords for the fun of it. They obviously had the income, and they worked the farms, or their tenants worked the farms and the properties. Yes, the A1, as it now is, did go through the middle of town. The Angel, that used to have stables at the back. The Swan and Talbot had stables at the back. There were something like stabling for 400 or more horses in the various inns and pubs. If you look at the Three Legs, the Swan and the Angel, you can still see the archways where the wagons and coaches would be driven through to the stables at the back. And many of these pubs and inns, there was a distinction, had soldiers' rooms in the lofts, because there were soldiers passing through. All sorts of people passed through. You'll remember the work that Bob did on the Drovers, Drovers Day, that's now become part of Wetherby. You know, yes, you're quite right, Eric. Wetherby was quite a prosperous town, and it was amazing to see what was going off and what an important place it was with regards to the area. Spofford used to be the mother church, and we only got the church in
1840s.
In the 1840s. So, Wetherby was a busy place.
Ian, you've done quite a lot of research on that period of history. What can you tell us?
Well, going back to what you said about selling off a town, if you owned a town, it would be quite important. But if you look, and I haven't researched this in particular, but bits and pieces that I do know, the Duke of Devonshire still owns Chatsworth. There's been a couple of documentaries on Channel 4 about the estate at Chatsworth and how big it is and what it does. He also owns Bolton Abbey and the estates round there.
Yep.
He has estates to this day, has estates in Ireland and wherever. So in terms of his total empire in 1824, a little town in Wetherby, and it was little, you're talking about a couple of thousand or less people. It perhaps wasn't that important to him. Following on from what Roger said, what is important and interesting historically, and I think it makes Wetherby unique, is we've got a copy of the original catalogue, and within that there are maps of the town centre and a map of the estate. When you look on television and they show you these archaeological digs, somebody gets in a trench and scrapes away for ages, and then you see a line of stones or something, and then an expert comes in and says, I think this might have been the wall of a chapel or possibly a barn or this, that and the other. We've got maps of the town of Wetherby exactly as it was, down to the inch. All the buildings are included on it, and so we know exactly what each lot was, what the functions of all the buildings were. There's no sort of guessing, was this a pigsty or pig coat, as they sometimes call it in the catalogue. So it's a gold mine of information, and it's a snapshot of the town at a particular point in time, and the level of detail is incredible. The auctioneers must have spent a load of time preparing the maps and the catalogue. The first lot is the one that Roger referred to, the Swan and Talbot. The catalogue entry says, and I apologise for the detail, but it just illustrates the point I'm trying to make, that Lot 1, the occupier was William Hind. It was the Swan and Talbot Inn and Posting House, containing 5 rooms in addition to kitchens, etc. Soldier's room, 8 best bedrooms, 5 servants' rooms, post-horse stables for 11 horses, open stables, cow houses, hay chambers, coal and bottle houses, containing 2 roods and 18 perches. And although I'm fairly ancient, I'm forgotten all I ever knew about roods and perches.
Rods, poles and perches, yes. Yeah, back a bit.
Yeah. So, that level of detail there, together with a large garden on the opposite side of the road and a stone building known as the Old Courthouse and a courtroom, 7-stall stable, etc., containing 2 roods and 16 perches. Also a small field adjoining the stable, 10 perches to be fenced off by the purchaser. And that was sold to Mr. Clemishaw of Wetherby, and he paid £1,510 for it.
Yes.
And that's, if you think about Wetherby now, as you're going up the North Street, the Swan and Talbot's on your right, and at the other side of the road is the manor house and garden. That was all in one lot then. Now it's obviously 2, maybe 3 separate properties.
Yeah.
So the level of detail that we've got, that's the first lot. And it's fairly easy to follow and trace because the Swan and Talbot was a pub and posting house, and now it's a pub and
it was bought by a local person.
Yes, Mr. Clemishaw.
And was that the situation for most of the lots, that they were bought by local people, or did we have other landlords coming from out of the town?
I think they were both. Obviously, to take advantage of buying some of these serious chunks of land, you needed some serious chunks of money.
Yes, yeah.
And, it was a lot of money to find.
I think there was some kind of agency in it, because one name which crops up for a lot of places was Glossop, and I think that was somebody buying on behalf of clients.
Right.
Again, you've got to go level by level by level to find all this out. The other person who seems to have been able to buy quite a lot of stuff, Quentin Rhodes. He bought the brewery and several pubs and quite a lot of other properties. And it turns out he was one of the main benefactors when they built the church. What we now have and think of as the town hall, and in fact the auction was held in Wetherby Town Hall, but it was a much smaller building off to the side in what we now call the Market Square, and the present Town Hall was built later, and he was a big benefactor for that. And at the same time they were building St James's Church, and he paid for the peal of bells that went into the tower. So there was obviously some, as Roger said, some local money involved, as well as people speculating and investing. And the Wetherby News subsequently did a couple of articles, one 50 years after the sale and another 100 years, 1924. And one of the comments they came up with was that a lot of the tenants wanted to buy their own property rather than remain as tenants, and they overstretched themselves financially. They got auction fever and kept bidding and bidding when perhaps they shouldn't have bid. And in subsequent years there was quite a bit of financial hardship caused by the fact that they had these mortgages where previously they just paid as fixed rent.
The Duke was quite a kind landlord because the rents he charged were not excessive, is the best way to put it.
Is that why then he might well have had to sell, because rather than get money from the town being a busy place and people paying up, do you think that may have precipitated the sale?
He could get a rather large lump of money in 4 days with relatively little effort.
And is there any precedent anywhere else that you've come across where such a sale has taken place?
I'm sure it happened elsewhere, but
not evidenced.
I've enough on my plate keeping track of what happens in Wetherby.
Is there evidence that the Duke actually came to Wetherby Because with a lot of these estates, I understand that they're inherited.
I don't
People
know whether
very
they actually
rarely
did.
visited them.
I don't know actually whether they did. I, in terms of visitors and famous visitors, I found an article in the Wetherby News way back when the author Charles Dickens was on one of his travels. You know, he based Dotheboys Hall, the school, famous school up in Yorkshire.
Yeah.
I think it was when he was on his way north to study and have a look round that, doing his research for a novel. He actually booked a room in the Swan and Talbot.
Right.
So I've got a newspaper reference to a letter that was found, but the letter seems to have disappeared and nobody seems to know where they actually did come and what he thought of the place. But it's referenced that Charles Dickens stayed in Wetherby.
We're talking with Ian and with Roger about Wetherby 200, which is the great sale of Wetherby, which took place in October of 1824. Let's go back to the sale. You were saying earlier, Ian, that this had been greatly researched. The auctioneers clearly had spent a lot of time and effort getting all the information together. How long do you think a task like that might have taken? It sounds like it's several months, if not a year in advance.
I don't have an actual length of time that I can quote for you, but I do agree to get that level of detail, both in terms of the measurements and rods, poles and perches, and also to document each individual's function, building's function. There's an enormous amount of effort in that, and if you look at the map, it spreads over quite a big area. So there's a lot of preparation gone on to that. So once the Duke had committed to the sale, he didn't hold back. He got what obviously was a top-class team to do the job for him.
I think it's worth pointing out that the Duke's agent in Scotland, they would have called him the factor, would already have a lot of this information so that they could issue the appropriate notices requiring rent to be paid and all that sort of thing. Their record should have been a good start, put it that way.
Thinking about that aspect, so with your background from the legal profession, Roger, how much work would have been necessary and how understandable would it have been to the people trying to buy the properties, particularly the guy who's trying to buy his own garden?
I think that it would have taken quite some time, bearing in mind there was no such thing as computers and typewriters and things like that. It would all have been done by hand, it would all have been written out by hand, and then the actual catalogue was printed, but that would all be set by hand. It's fair to say that the title to the estate would have gone back a long way, but would have been relatively straightforward because the Duke having owned it for so long. I think so far as the individual bidders were concerned, they probably wouldn't have understood all that much about it. Some would have understood more than others, but if their own lawyer would have been there to advise them, and they would have probably just said, "Oh, it's fine, just get on with it." There was no such thing as a Majesty's Land Registry, His Majesty's Land Registry in those days, and conveyancing was normally a lot of paper and a lot of, I wouldn't say routine, but there were ways of doing these things. I've always found land and property quite fascinating. It's interesting looking at the plan of the Lordship of Wetherby, looking at everything that's included, that the Swinnow Hall estate was excluded. That was owned by somebody called Wilson in those days. It really is quite a fascinating thing because all the plans were drawn originally by hand, and it just makes you think, yes, there was a lot of work, a hell of a lot of work. It's interesting that there was an offer in the catalogue that a London lawyer, and I think it was the same one who was acting for the Duke, said that for a certain fee, which was quite small, he would act for any buyer, which caused a bit of uproar because you're not really supposed to have the same lawyer acting for the buyer and the seller. But I don't know what actually happened with that.
Did they know the word vested interest in those days?
Yeah. I mean, the thing is, it's like everything else. A lot of people that bought their properties, they would probably never have been involved with a lawyer before. Many people now, even today, only deal with solicitors when they buy or sell a house or a property, or they make a will. It's quite a... I find the whole legal thing, property, I find it fascinating.
doing some research, you're looking in various directories that have been published, you can work out properties. And I've worked out that lots 12 and 13, which I've just said about, was actually number 18, the High Street, and it was a dwelling house in 1824. In the mid-1800s, it was a pub called the Yorkshire Hussars, and reputedly they were barracked at the other side of the river in that facade that's now been converted into apartments, where the walls collapsed.
Micklethwaite, isn't it, that part?
Yes, yeah. So that was Yorkshire Hussars public house, and then in 1925 it was occupied by Hugh Hall, an ironmonger, and he continued there from the 20s up into the 60s, and legend has it that he used the old beer pumps from the cellar to pump paraffin up, because people went there to get cans of paraffin for lighting at home before electricity.
Yes.
And apparently he had, down in the cellar, he had a tinsmith who patched kettles and pots and pans. And when his shop closed down, the Castle Museum in York came and took the entire contents of the tinsmith's shop with all the tools and bits and pieces of the trade, and they're now in the Castle Museum in York. And Hugh himself was a very famous character, and he lived to be 100 years old, and apparently he worked in his shop every day till he died. The story going round Wetherby is he was the most famous man in the whole of the UK, and the reason for that is that every night when the BBC light programme closed down, the BBC announcer in his BBC accent said, "Good night to Hugh Hall."
It's the way you tell them.
After it shut down, Mallory's Confectioners.
Don't remember that.
You don't remember that?
No.
That was followed by another confectioners called Watson's Bakers, and that went on until about 1996. And then the Shoe Shop currently occupies the premises. So we've gone through various occupations over a span of 200 years. And within the town, it's relatively easy to trace different occupants in different premises. But once you start getting out in the country, nothing happened. Nobody took photographs. People take photographs of old buildings, but they don't take photographs of a field. And then there was a building boom, and so all the estates like First Avenue, Second Avenue, Third Avenue in at the back of Hallfield Lane, they were built in the 50s. And then the houses between Walton Road and the River Wharf, Riverdale and Glendale and all those. And then you work your way up the old Great North Road, and housing estates, Ainsley housing estate was post-war what we used to call council houses. And they're now expensive houses in their own right. All those estates. And finding out where the modern streets fit in with the old street boundaries, where you've got very few fixed points, is a little bit of guesswork and nudging and shifting to make things fit.
Thanks ever so much, Ian, Roger, for coming in, because there's just so much more to talk about Wetherby and its history. Roger Taylor and Ian Ledley were in studio talking to my good friend Paul Andrews and myself about the Great Sale of Wetherby and its background from 1824.